Do you guys ever feel like God is confusing to you? Do you ever feel like God has prompted you to do something, you're pretty convinced that was the right thing to do, it was the right direction that God had for you, and yet it doesn't work out the way you thought it was going to. It doesn't go the way you thought it should, like he should have done had you done what he wanted you to. Do you ever wonder what he's doing? Like one of the threads that goes all the way through the Bible is the people of God trying to follow along with God, and yet coming to these places where they don't understand what God's doing. So if you've ever felt that way, I think today's message is for you, and I'm excited that you're here. I want to welcome you to WellSpring. I'm Andy. I'm one of the guys here on staff. I'm just so glad to be a part of this today. I think this is an important message for us, and I think we'll get into that here in just a minute. This is week 4 of the series we've called the Scarlet Thread, and to help us out this morning, I want you to turn to Joshua chapter 3. We're going to take this passage today and kind of walk through Joshua chapter 3. It's page 147 in the Bibles here in your seats. Grab one of those, and we'll be there right now. We'd love for you to take one of these Bibles if you can make use of that. That would be great as well. Joshua chapter 3, page 147. I told last hour, I know I say this a lot about different passages, but this is one of my favorite verses in the whole Bible. I've got like 87, I think, that are on my, one of my favorites, but this is one of my favorites. And so I'm glad that we get to share this together this morning. I think this is going to be fun to walk through together. Joshua chapter 3, we're going to start in verse 1, but let me give you a little backup in case this is new information to you. If you've never read through Joshua 3, I know we come from a lot of different places spiritually. Joshua chapter 3 is the beginning of Joshua's leadership. He was a leader of God's people. So Moses had been the leader back in the book of Deuteronomy, and before, at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, he dies. And then Joshua takes over as the new leader, and God's wanting to establish him as the new leader. So he tells him, be strong, courageous in your leadership with people. Trust me, be bold, be courageous, have faith, all of that. And then they investigate the first city they're going to have to face. And Rahab is there, and there's a scarlet thread that she uses to clue the people. That's where this whole analogy comes from in Joshua chapter 2. And then he says, I want you to consecrate yourself. That was last week. Set yourself aside. Prepare your mind and heart. Trust in me. Big things are coming. And I've said all along, this really kind of goes along with where we're at as a church. God's getting ready to do some big things in our church, and we got to consecrate ourselves. We got to be bold, strong, courageous, and bold. And today's message is just perfect for all of that as well. And so now we get to Joshua chapter 3, and verse 1 says, early in the morning, Joshua and all the Israelites set out from Shittim and went out to the Jordan where they camped before crossing over. They spent 3 days there, and after 3 days, the officers went throughout the camp giving orders to the people, when you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God and the Levitical priests carrying it, you're to move out from your positions and follow it. Now, it says the ark of the covenant there. Let me make sure we're all on the same page about that. That's just not just Harrison Ford and Raiders of the Lost Ark and all those things. I have no pictures of German faces melting or anything like that. That'd been kind of cool if I did. But the Ark of the Covenant was a large wooden box covered with gold, and inside of this box was some memorabilia, maybe how you would say it, of things that they had done throughout the history of walking with God together. Hebrews chapter 9 describes that in a small section. It says, behind the second curtain was a room called the Most Holy Place. This is in the tabernacle. And the Most Holy Place is where God was said to dwell, both in the tabernacle and in the temple. And they had the golden altar of incense and the gold-covered Ark of the Covenant. That's this box we're talking about. This ark contained 3 things: the gold jar of manna that represents all the manna he had provided for them over all those years, providing food for them day and night. He provided Aaron's staff that had budded. That was a show of God's power as well. And the stone tablets of the covenant, the 10 commandments that God wrote with his own hand. Above the ark were the cherubim of the glory overshadowing the atonement cover. So here in this ark, this large wooden box, this heavy wooden box inlaid with gold, had these 3 items: the ark of the covenant, the tablets of the covenant, 10 commandments, the jar of manna, and Aaron's staff. And the ark represented the presence of God. So if the ark was with the army, God was with the army. If the ark was not with the army, God was not with the army. It had great power. That's why Harrison Ford and the others wanted it and were willing to face the face melting and all of that stuff to find it. So they gave the ark utmost respect. Now we're going to read in just a minute. Let me give you a warning before we get there so you know what we're talking about. They're to say 2,000 cubits behind the ark. That's about a half a mile. We don't talk in cubits today. About a half a mile. And I think that distance is interesting. I'm going to just give you some foreshadowing before we get into it. It's a show of respect There's a couple million people there following God. So if the ark was here and a couple million people were right up on top of it, it was like a little too familiar. So God says, let it be out in front, about a half a mile, so that you give it a show of respect. But a half a mile also allows you to see clearly where it's going. So it's not there miles ahead. You can stay with it because you've got to follow God, and the ark represented that. Now, this is important as we look into verse 4. Verse 4 says, then, if you follow the ark, half a mile back, then you will know which way to go, since you have never been this way before. But keep a distance of about 2,000 cubits, half a mile, between you and the ark, and do not go near it. It says, then you will know which way to go, since you've not been this way before. It's good advice. This is great advice for you. Great advice for them, great advice for you. If you're in a situation where you've never been this way before and you don't know where you're going, keep lots of respect for God. Show him that respect. He knows what he's doing. But also follow him because he knows where he's going. It's great advice. If you're ever in a situation where you don't know where you're going, this has been a refrain of my life time and again. So many times where I didn't know where I was going, I'd never been this way before, and I needed God to show me. So I tried to keep respect for God, but also tried to follow him in the thing. Like when I first got married, I didn't have a clue what I was doing when I first got married. God, you're going to help me. I've never been this way before. First job was that way. I don't know what I'm doing, God. Show me which way to go. I remember when I started having kids, oh my word, I thought I was so smart until I had kids, and then I realized I'm an idiot. Like when you have kids, you absolutely do not know what you're doing. You don't know which way you're going. All the way through my parenting, it's been true. When they were born, I thought, when is this child ever going to sleep? Please, for the love of everything that's holy, can you just sleep for just a moment? That would be great. And then they began to walk, and I thought, when's this kid going to chill out and sit down so I can take a break and do something else? It really is the prayer of a parent. You want your kid to walk, that'd be so sweet. You want them to talk, it'd be so sweet. When they start walking and talking, will you just please sit down and hush? Like, that would be so sweet if you did that. That's the prayer of a parent. So when then they started school and they were gone all day, and how do you handle that? How do you do those things? And then they get their teen years. That's a whole different ball of wax. And then they go to stupid college, and I've never been this way before. I don't know what I'm doing here. It's all the way through. God has reminded me, you don't know what you're doing. You've never been this way before. You better give me proper respect. Trust me. I have been this way before. I do know which way you're going, and follow me as I lead out. Moment after moment after moment. Such good advice. Such good advice. Then we get to verse 5. Verse 5 says, then Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you. Now, if you want to know more about that passage, all last week's message was on that. You can look online for that. But the idea of consecrating yourself, set yourselves apart. You're God's. You're not your own. You're God's. So set yourself apart. And I think this week was a great reminder. The family of WellSpring got a great reminder of a consecrated life this week on Friday. On Friday. In John chapter 14, Jesus was telling his friends about his upcoming death. And he says in verse 2, there is more than enough room in my Father's house. If this were not so, I would have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you. And when everything's ready, I will come and get you, and you will always be with me where I am. When everything's ready, I'll come and get you so that you can be with me. He came and got Shirley Connolly, a long-term part of our family, on Friday morning. I was talking to Shirley's daughter, Melinda, this weekend, and she reminded me, I'd kind of forgotten about it, but apparently Shirley never forgot about it. She talked about it quite a bit. When she and I first met, it was back in the school. Shirley's been with the church for a long time, so we're back in the elementary school. And I don't know how old Shirley is. I never guess a woman's age past like 29. So I don't know how old Shirley was. I'm pretty sure her grandkids may be 29. So that gives you a ballpark where we're at. But I never guess. I don't know how old she was. But I met Shirley, and we're just talking. And if you've ever met Shirley, she's got an opinion or two that she's willing to share with you about life. So she was telling me about all these churches she'd been to. And she didn't know I was the pastor of the church. So she's telling me about this church, and it'd been terrible because this reason. This church, and pastors, you know how pastors are. She started telling me about how pastors were, and she had all this great examples of how pastors were not always the way pastors should be. And I'm listening, I'm talking to her and all this kind of stuff. And then service starts, and she sat down, and I got up, and then I got up to speak, and she was mortified because she had told the pastor about how terrible pastors were. And Shirley's been part of our church ever since, back since the school days. He came and got her Friday morning. Her service will be Monday night at the Spring Hill Memorial Gardens. And then later that morning, he came and got our friend Cherry Kozlowski. Cherry's been on part of our youth staff for over 10 years. Near and dear to so many of the teens and young adults in our church and the adults who serve with her. Her service will be later on this month here at the church. We'll let you know about that when that gets finalized. But I was there with Cherry when God came and got her. And he said, I'm going to go away, I'll come back, and I'll get you. And I was there when he did. And her family was right there singing Amazing Grace right as he came and got her, praying over her. And I can tell you, it kind of felt like that. There's no struggle. There was no, her body had gotten very, very weak, but her soul was strong. And God will do that for you. You know, you need that. I need that. And one day we'll follow their steps. And when you get there, you need to have a strong soul, because your body's going to fail you, but your soul doesn't have to. And you need God in your life for that. And I can promise you that today, right now, if we could hear from either of these two dear ladies, having seen what they've seen the last 2 days, that they would tell us that being with God, consecrated for His use, set aside for His purposes, is better than anything else this life has to offer. And I promise you, if you could hear from either of these two dear ladies today, and if you knew either one of them, you knew they had an opinion and were willing to share it, if you gave them a chance, if you could hear from them today, they would be clearer today than they've ever been in their life about what matters, about what doesn't matter, about what things are important and what things are not important. And they would beg of us to put our life fully in God's hands, as their life is fully in God's hands now. And it served them so well this week. And I think they would tell us today to stop flitting back and forth between the ways of the world and the ways of God, and the ways of the world and the ways of God, because now they see more clearly than they ever have, more clearly than we do, and they would encourage us to see this life differently, to set ourselves apart for God. And here in Joshua 3, God's on the verge of doing something big in their lives, and He tells them the same advice. Consecrate yourself. Set yourself aside for God, because that's what really matters in this life. And then look at verse 6. This is so cool. Verse 6 says, then Joshua told the priests, take up the Ark of the Covenant, that big heavy wooden box, and pass on ahead of the people. So they took it up, they went ahead of them. And the Lord said to Joshua, today I will begin to exalt you as the leader in the eyes of all Israel, so that they may know that I'm with you as I was with Moses. And tell the priests who carry the Ark of the Covenant, when you reach the edge of the Jordan's waters, go stand in the river. That's important. If you don't know the story, catch that for later. To stand in the water, in the river. Now Joshua said to the Israelites, come here, listen to the words of the Lord your God. This is how you will know the living God is among you, and He will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, Jebusites. See, the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. That's a great picture. Now then, choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe. As soon as the priests who carry the Ark of the Lord of all the earth, set foot in the Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will be cut off, and they'll stand up in a heap. So when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them, and the Jordan is at flood stage all during the harvest. Now, that last phrase, I want to stop a second, because that's a key one. The Jordan River is at flood stage all during the harvest. So every year, at this time of year, the Jordan River is at flood stage. God brought the people to the water when it's at flood stage. This wasn't a rare event. This is something they could plan every year. They knew when the flood stage was going to happen, and God chose to bring them there during flood stage. Now, when it's not during the flood stage, crossing the Jordan is not that big a deal. Some of you have been to the Middle East. You've seen the Jordan River, not that big a deal. When the Jordan is at flood stage, it's a very big deal. It's one of the fastest rivers in all the earth, because it flows down south from Mount Hermon in the north down to the Dead Sea, which is one of the lowest points on the earth. So there's a large elevation drop, very fast river. And studies say today that the Jordan River today is only a small percentage of what it was back in those times, for lots of reasons that I don't fully understand. But I've read some geologists who said these things to me, and it was a much bigger river then than it is now. That at flood stage, during Bible times, experts have predicted it may have been as much as a mile wide and 100 feet deep at its deepest, and fast flowing. And it was during this stage that God brought them here. So question, why did God bring them to the point of crossing during the harvest if the river's always at flood stage during the harvest? I mean, just stop and consider for a minute. For 40 years, the people have been wandering around. God's told them where to go. For 40 years, they've meandered around. Finally, it's time to go in. Why in the world did God bring them to the Jordan River after 40 years of meandering right at the wrong time? The only time they couldn't cross on their own. After 40 years, let me ask it a different way. After 40 years, he brings them up to the Jordan River right at the wrong time, right when it's at flood stage. Do you think that was an accident, or do you think that was on purpose? I think it was on purpose. Question is, why was it on purpose? Well, this is another thread throughout the Bible that you see again and again, and you see it in your life, and I see it in mine. What does every miracle in the Bible have in common? Problems. They all have problems. The blind man that Jesus healed was blind. The lame man that Jesus healed was lame. The 5,000 people that Jesus fed were all hungry. In fact, Rick Stedman says if you have problems, you are a candidate for a miracle. Anybody have problems in the room? A few of you. You're all candidates for miracles. And in Scripture, they were big problems. I mean, I read the Bible this week looking for it. You never see Jesus giving a LASIK miracle procedure to get a nearsighted dude to 20/20. You never see that. It was blind. Now it's funnier than that, for heaven's sakes. It was blind people that Jesus healed. It was lame people Jesus healed. It was hungry people he fed. And here they crossed the Jordan River, not when it's a trickle. Anybody can do that. It was when it's at flood stage that he crossed the Jordan River. And if you want to see a miracle in your life, you're probably going to have some problems right before that. So it's important that you look at problems the right way. So many of us look at problems the wrong way. Look at how the Apostle Paul looked at problems. 2 Corinthians 12 says, 3 different times I begged the Lord to take it away, a problem that he had. Each time he said, God said, my grace is all you need. My power works best when you're weak. So now Paul says, I'm glad to boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ may work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses, in my insults, in hardships, persecutions, troubles, that I suffer for Christ. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. I want you to notice those 2 words in the middle, so that. I take delight in weaknesses. I brag about my weaknesses. I acknowledge my weaknesses so that God's power may rest on me. Do you want Christ's power to rest on you? It's probably going to come in the context of weakness, in the context of trouble and hardship. If you want a miracle, you're probably going to have problems before that. So if you got problems, you got weaknesses, you may not be as weak as you think you are. Because when you're weakest, and you know this, you've felt this before if you're walking with God, when you're in your weakness, you feel sometimes God's presence the most. Isn't that right? Like he's holding your hand a bit. Look what happens next. This is such a cool passage. Verse 14. Let me go back, just give some context. 14 says, so the people broke camp across the Jordan. The priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan's at flood stage, all during the harvest, and as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing and it piled up in a heap. It piled up in a heap. So this is not a small trickle. This is the Jordan River, maybe as much as a mile wide, maybe as much as 100 feet deep. I want to see video footage of that. Like, I'm not sure, but Cherry and Shirley may be watching video footage of that right now, because in heaven, I'm sure they've got some high-def video footage of all this kind of stuff. I want to see it. So, I mean, can you imagine that? They step out, the priests step in, the water piles up, mile wide, 100 feet deep, piles up right there. I want to see that, but that's not the picture. I stopped reading too early on purpose. Look a little further. Verse 16, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the Sea of Arabah, that's the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. That's important geography. We'll see that in a second. The priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground while all the Israel passed by till the whole nation had completely crossed on dry ground. Look at this map a second. So they broke camp from Shittim. That's over here on the right side. They were going over to Jericho, a straight shot across. But it says the water piled up in a heap when they stepped in the river up at Adam. That's 18 miles away. This is where it gets a little confusing, so stick with me. We don't know what happened. Did they step in the water and then it dried up in front of them immediately because God began to work a couple hours before they got there? So he piles it up in Adam, but then the water's still flowing, and they're getting ready, and here it comes the dry, and they step out, and the water dries up in front of them? Maybe. Or did they step in the water, and God began to work at Adam 18 miles away, but for a couple hours they had to stand there and watch the river continue to flow as normal? We don't know. I've talked to some Hebrew scholars, we don't know. The text doesn't tell us. And sometimes when the text doesn't tell us things, it gets frustrating to me. I'm like, God, why didn't you add a little more detail there? I would have liked a little more information right there. Why didn't you tell? But this is not one of those cases because God works both ways. Sometimes you step out for God and immediately something dries up in front of you because he began to work long before you got there. And so as soon as you step out, it all dries up in front of you. And you're like, man, God was great, upstream. Other times you step out for God and you do what you think he told you to do, and you don't see anything change. Water continues to flow, water continues to flow, water continues to flow. Only later do you realize that if you, at the same time you stepped out, God began to work up here, you just didn't see it for a while. Nothing seemed to change right here, but everything changed right here because you stepped out and God began to work. And if you, a bit later, you see the water clear up in front of you. God works in both of those ways. God didn't say, and this is so important, God didn't say, hey, come to the edge of the river. Here's the river here. Come to the edge of the river and just stand and watch me do something cool. He didn't say that. I would love it if God did it that way. That's not how God does it typically. God says, go ahead and get in, and then I'm going to do some stuff, but I'm not really even telling you what I'm going to do. It's just going to be okay. I want you to stand in the water at flood stage with everyone watching, and then I want you to wait for me, and then wait for me, and then wait for me, and then wait for me. Trusting that I'm working upstream. You just can't see it yet. You see, our God is an upstream God, and he responds best to our obedience. Don't you know there's all kinds of temptation there? Like can't you imagine, because people are people, right? So this is a long time ago. Technology is different, but people are the same. There probably wasn't social media or iHeart Spring Hill in those days, but people are the same people. So when they're standing in the water and nothing's happening, don't you know the chatter took about 34 seconds to start? Look at those idiots out there standing in the water. Can you believe that? Those are the people leading us. They probably can't even widen duplex. You just know there's all kinds of chatter going on about the priests. And they were standing there holding this box for hours. So let me ask you a question. Is there any part of your life where you're living in disobedience to God? I mean, you know that God nudged you to do this, whatever that is for you. And maybe you're planning on it, you're just delayed, it's just delayed obedience. You wouldn't say it's disobedience, that sounds harsh. It's delayed obedience. You sense God nudging, but you haven't moved. Maybe it's out of fear, maybe it's out of selfishness. You know it's going to cost you to do what you think God told you to do. I'm not ready to do that yet. Maybe it's out of doubt or pain or distraction, but you're living in disobedience. Or delayed obedience, which is sort of the same thing. Anybody have kids want to testify to that? Sort of the same thing. Our God is an upstream God, and he responds best to our obedience. And I love how this whole section is so action-oriented. God knows our weaknesses. He knows that we're procrastinators. He knows that we're going to make excuses. So it's all action-oriented. He starts by saying, be strong and courageous. A couple weeks ago. Trust in God. Be bold in your faith. Lean on me. Be bold in the way you do this thing. And then he says, consecrate yourself. Set yourself aside for his purposes. Prepare your mind and heart. Big things are coming. You got to get ready for that. And then he says, take a step. Because God knows if he doesn't move us to action, we'll never do it. We'll just think about it and get distracted and then rethink about it and feel guilty and then think about it and we'll never do it. And our God is an upstream God, and he responds best to our obedience. I just think we asked the wrong question. The question of this story is not, hey, Israelites, hey, WellSpring, hey, Andy, would you like a miracle in your life? Yeah, take that. Everybody wants that. There's some waters in my life, quote unquote, that I want parted. There's some things going on that I'd like God to step in and move some stuff out of the way. That'd be great. Yeah, sign me up, God, for that. Relationships that are broken, finances that are a mess, anxiety, fear, worry, just debilitating. Would anybody like to have that moved? Yeah, move that flood water out of the way, God. I need some help with that. I would love a miracle or two in my life, and I know you have some. But that's not the question. The question is not, would you like a miracle? The question is, am I willing to be strong and courageous? To trust God when everything inside of me wants to run away. To be bold in my faith when everyone around me tells me I'm crazy for listening to God. Don't you just know, I love this metaphor, don't you just know the priest wanted to drop the box? They're standing there in the water carrying this heavy, heavy box, and nothing's changing, and chattering's happening, and the water's continuing, and their feet are getting all pruny and wrinkly. And don't you know that everything inside of them wanted to say, let's just drop the stupid box. And what a metaphor that is for some of you right now. You're carrying a heavy box, and you feel like you're doing what God said to do, and everything inside of you wants to drop the box. And you don't think God's told you to yet. Be strong and courageous, friend. Be strong and courageous. Am I willing to consecrate myself? The question is not, do I want a miracle? Am I willing to be strong and courageous? Am I willing to consecrate myself, to set myself aside for God's purposes, even if I have to stand in the river for a long time for God? I mean, here's this is a big shift for some of you. It's a big shift for me. If I'm my own guy, I'm in charge of my life, then if God tells me to stand in the river, I'll do that if he's going to dry it up. All right, that's a quid pro quo. Okay, God, you dry it up, I'll stand in the river. Sure, I'll do that. But if I'm God's, if I've consecrated myself and I'm not me anymore, I'm his, now it doesn't matter what he does. He tells me to stand in the river, I'll do it whether he dries it up or not, because he told me to. And man, that's a shift. And the order matters. God says consecrate yourself and then go stand in the river. And some of you are standing in the river and you're waiting for God to show up and he's not. And you don't know why he's not. And maybe it's getting ready to come around the corner. That'd be great. We'll celebrate that together. Or maybe you're going to get, as Hebrews says, all the way to the end of your life, never having seen him dry up the river. And you'll get to the other side and join our friends there and look back and realize he cleared it all up. It just took a little longer than you thought it was going to. But it's not about you anymore. If you consecrate yourself, it's not about you. It's not about me. Now you're standing in the river, not because he's going to dry it up. You're standing in the river because he told you to. If he dries it up, great. If he doesn't, okay, I'm not mine anymore. And some of you right now are standing in the river holding a heavy box and you want to set it down and you want to quit and you're hearing the chatter. And I want to say to you, be strong and courageous because you've set yourself aside for God. The question is, am I willing to be strong and courageous? Am I willing to consecrate myself? Am I willing to take a step to surrender myself to God, to surrender the leadership of my life to God? He's now in charge. To surrender his ability to work upstream in my life, even when it looks impossible right in front of me. To surrender to God knowing he can do the impossible even when I cannot. So I'm not going to ask you the question, do you want a miracle? Everybody wants a miracle. Yeah, God, clear it up. Great. My question is, are you willing to be strong and courageous? Are you willing to consecrate yourself? Are you willing to take a step? And if you're not, when are you going to be? Because delayed obedience and disobedience are kind of the same thing. Why don't you bow your head? Let me pray over you and with you. God, we need your power to be at work in our lives. We all have some flood stage going on in our lives, in our homes. There's some here whose relationship is a mess. It's at flood stage, right at the edge. Not sure we can take any more. Some people have gotten medical news. Some people have got painful, gripping anxiety and fear and worry. Some have got job things, financial things. There's flood stage all over this room, God, where we're right up to the edge in this area, can't take any more. And we need you to part some waters in ways that only you can, that we can't. You can, we can't. But you don't ask us if we want you to part waters. You ask us, are we willing to obey you? To be strong and courageous, to consecrate ourselves for your purposes and ends and means, and then to take a step. And God, I just believe that a number of us, starting right here with me, a number of us have some steps in our life that we know you've told us to take that we just haven't taken yet. And we're fixing to, but we haven't done it yet. And I think for some of us it's time to do that today. So I pray that you'd help us to be bold, strong, courageous today in taking a step for you, in setting ourselves aside for you. Church, take a moment just to be still before God. If there's things you need to tell him, tell him. If you just need to sit still, sit still. But ask him what this looks like for you. Translate this. Have him translate this for you to your life, your context, your family. And then I'll pray as well. God, we surrender ourselves to you. We put our life, our family, our home, our job, our careers, our money, our health, our kids, put it all in your hands. We don't stand at the edge of the water and watch you do something. We get in. We're ready. Whatever you need us to do, God. So I pray that every point of prayer would be heard by you, and you'd give boldness and courage to say yes where you call. We surrender ourselves to you fully because you're trustworthy. We pray in the name of Jesus.